There is a cemetery in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, that contains a mass grave of approximately 350 people. Nobody knows who they are. Their bodies were burned beyond identification the night they were buried, which is the same night the entire American press was looking 260 miles to the south at a burning barn on DeKoven Street in Chicago. That is where this story starts. Not with the cow, not with the lantern. With the fact that on the night of October 8, 1871, the single deadliest wildfire in American history was consuming an entire region of the country, and the newspapers, every major newspaper in the nation, spent the next week writing about a different fire. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Before watching this video, had you ever heard of the Peshtigo Fire? Drop your answer in the comments right now, yes or no, because I have a feeling most of you are about to realize that something was quietly removed from the version of history you were taught. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say a different region. I don't mean a nearby field. I mean simultaneous major fires burning in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Indiana, in Iowa, in Minnesota, with prairie fires charring parts of Illinois beyond Chicago, and additional forest fires reported the same week on the flanks of the Alleghenies, the Sierra Nevada, and the Rocky Mountains. That is what the Weather Almanac of the University of Wisconsin-Madison documents when it analyzes the meteorological records of autumn 1871. I found this while looking at something else entirely. I was researching historical fire suppression failures in 19th century American cities. What I expected to find was a story about poor infrastructure. What I found instead was a calendar date that looked, the more I examined it, less like a coincidence and more like a threshold. October 8th, 1871. That date doesn't appear in most American history curricula. You know it if you're from Chicago. You might not know it if you're from anywhere else. And that, as I kept researching, is itself the most important part of the story. Let me give you the factual foundation first, because this story deserves one. By July of 1871, the Great Lakes region was already in the grip of a severe, multi-month drought. The U.S. Weather Bureau office in Chicago, which had only been established the year before, in 1870, as part of the Army Signal Corps, recorded just 3.55 inches of precipitation from July 7th through October 8th. That was nearly 8 inches below the historical average for that stretch. According to the National Weather Service Chicago office's own Centennial Analysis, published in 2021, this was the second driest such 93-day period on record as of that writing, surpassed only by 1939. Leaves had begun dropping from trees as early as July. Smoke from smaller fires in Canada and across Iowa had been visible for weeks. On the evening of October 7th, the night before the catastrophe, Chicago's fire department was already exhausted from fighting a 4-block blaze on the west side that had required nearly half the city's resources to contain. The Chicago Fire Department at that time consisted of 185 firefighters, protecting a city of 324,000 people, with 17 horse-drawn steam pumpers. More than 2/3 of the structures in Chicago were constructed entirely of wood. The sidewalks were wood. Many of the roads were wood. The city had received exactly 0 rainfall in the 10 days preceding October 8th. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, 260 miles north of Chicago, conditions were worse. Peshtigo was a lumber company town owned largely by William B. Ogden, a Chicago millionaire who had built what was then the largest woodenware factory in the United States on those grounds. The roads into and out of town were covered in sawdust. The surrounding forests had been stripped by slash-and-burn clearing for farmland and railroad construction, leaving piles of dry brush beside the tracks. The floors of the houses were covered in sawdust. The town was not just made of wood, it was made of tinder. Smaller fires had been burning near Peshtigo for weeks. The town had stockpiled a large reservoir of water on September 23rd, preparing for the possibility of a fire coming their way. The residents smelled smoke daily. They had become accustomed to it. Familiarity with danger is its own kind of blindness. Now here is where the story shifts. On the evening of October 8th, an eastward-moving cold front accelerated across the Great Lakes region. The wind speed ahead of that front increased dramatically. In Peshtigo, what had been background burns in the surrounding forest were suddenly overtaken by those winds, and they merged. The firestorm that resulted was not a large fire in the conventional sense. It was a new category of event that people in 1871 did not have a scientific name for. Survivors described a column of fire that rotated. They described what one account called a tornado of flame. Temperatures inside the firestorm reached approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire generated its own internal wind system, with gusts estimated by researchers at up to 110 miles per hour. Father Peter Pernin was the Catholic parish priest of Peshtigo and the neighboring town of Marinette. On the evening of October 8th, he was in Peshtigo. He had narrowly avoided being stranded in Cedar River, Michigan the day before. A steamboat had passed his dock without stopping because the captain could not see through the dense smoke hanging over the waterfront. That small decision likely saved his life because Cedar River burned the following night. Father Pernin published his eyewitness account of October 8, 1871, in 1874, in a memoir titled, "The Finger of God is There." His account is the primary surviving first-person record of what happened in Peshtigo that night, and it is one of the most disturbing documents in 19th century American history. He describes a roaring that preceded the fire, a sound he compared to the noise of 1,000 storms compressed into one. He describes the sky turning a color that had no name. He gathered the tabernacle from his church, put it in a wagon, and pushed it into the Peshtigo River. He then waded in himself and stood in that river with hundreds of other survivors for 5.5 continuous hours, constantly splashing water over their heads to keep their clothing and skin from igniting in midair. He describes flames darting back and forth across the 400-foot width of the river above the heads of the people standing in it for most of the night. Those who could not reach water did not survive. 200 people died in a single tavern. 3 people who hid in a water tank boiled to death when the heat reached the tank. In the village of Sugarbush, a few miles from Peshtigo, every single resident was killed. In Williamsonville, 76 people were in that community when the fire hit. 19 survived. Williamsonville was never rebuilt. By the time the sun rose on October 9th, an area twice the size of Rhode Island had been reduced to ash. An 1873 report to the Wisconsin State Legislature listed 1,182 confirmed names of the dead or missing from the Peshtigo fire alone. Subsequent analysis of mass graves, some still being discovered in the 20th century, suggests the true toll was likely higher than the 2,200 people killed in the 1889 Johnstown flood. Some estimates place the Peshtigo dead at 2,500. The exact number cannot be known because the records were burned. That same night, while Father Pernin stood in that river, the town of Holland, Michigan burned. The town of Manistee, Michigan burned. The town of Port Huron, Michigan burned. And in Chicago, the fire that would consume 17,450 buildings, kill approximately 300 people, and leave 100,000 homeless, ignited sometime around 9 p.m. on DeKoven Street and began its march northward through the city. Now, here is where I need to stop and address something directly, Because there is a version of this story that gets told in a very specific way, and it is wrong in the ways that matter most. The version most people have heard goes like this. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was the worst fire in American history, started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow, and it reshaped the city into the architectural giant it became. I spent time verifying all three parts of that claim. The first part, that Chicago was the worst, is simply false by any measure of human life. The Peshtigo Fire killed somewhere between 5 and 8 times as many people as Chicago. The Great Lakes fires collectively killed over 1,700. Chicago was not the worst fire in American history. It was the most famous. The second part, the cow. In October 1997, the Chicago City Council officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary. The real origin of the fire on DeKoven Street remains undetermined. The cow story was apparently invented by a Chicago Tribune reporter named Michael Ahern, who admitted years later that he fabricated it to make the story more colorful. The city scapegoated an Irish immigrant woman for 126 years before formally clearing her name. The third part, that Chicago's fire reshaped the city, is complicated by something almost no one mentions. According to Professor Tom Jones of Eastern Michigan University and former director of Michigan's Historical Society, much of the lumber used to rebuild Chicago in the years following the fire was harvested from the very forests of Michigan and Wisconsin that had just been devastated by those simultaneous fires. The lumber that rebuilt Chicago came partly from the ashes of the towns that nobody remembered. Now I want to show you the pattern as a sequence, because the cumulative weight of what happened in autumn 1871 is something you have to see compressed to fully feel. From July through September 1871, the Great Lakes region received 1/4 of its normal rainfall. By early October, smaller fires were burning across at least 7 states. On the evening of October 7th, Chicago's fire department was already stretched. On the morning of October 8th, an advancing cold front pushed wind speeds across the entire region simultaneously. At approximately 9 p.m. that night, fire engulfed Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Within the same hour, Holland, Michigan was burning. Manistee, Michigan was burning. Before midnight, the Chicago fire had begun. By dawn on October 9th, 37 individual fire zones had been recorded across the Great Lakes region alone. By October 10th, light rain, too little, too late, fell across the burned areas. The fires stopped not because of the rain, but because there was nothing left to burn. In the weeks that followed, every major national newspaper ran front-page coverage of Chicago. The Peshtigo Fire, which had killed at least 5 times more people, was mentioned, when it was mentioned at all, as a footnote. The Chicago Tribune itself, on October 11th, called the Chicago Fire a conflagration which has no parallel in the annals of history. That newspaper, serving a city 260 miles from Peshtigo, apparently did not consider 2,000 dead Wisconsinites a parallel worth noting. The deadliest fire in American history was declared irrelevant within 2 weeks of its occurrence, because something more famous happened the same night. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the cities with better press connections. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. In the years after World War II, the United States and British military establishments studied the Peshtigo firestorm. Specifically, they studied the conditions that had produced a self-sustaining, internally wind-generating conflagration that could not be extinguished from outside. They built scale models. They tested the configurations. The research, documented by co-author Denise Guess in the 2002 book Firestorm at Peshtigo, contributed to the understanding of how to create firestorms over cities, an understanding that was applied in the bombing campaigns over Dresden and Tokyo. The deadliest wildfire in American history was, decades later, used as a technical blueprint for destroying other cities. That information was not in the history textbooks I read growing up. If this kind of forgotten history is what you come here for, the documented record that didn't make the curriculum, then subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, and the pattern of what gets remembered versus what gets quietly set aside is something I intend to keep pulling on. The Peshtigo Fire Cemetery still stands today. It sits just west of U.S. Highway 41 in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. It was entered on the National Register of Historic Places. The mass grave near its center holds approximately 350 people whose names were never recorded, whose identities were never recovered, who were buried together because their bodies could not be told apart. The cemetery exists, the names do not. And so I come back to the question I have not been able to let go of since I first pulled on this thread. If the Chicago fire had not happened that same night, if the cold front had tracked slightly differently, if the wind had shifted 2 degrees, if the barn on DeKoven Street had held, would the simultaneous burning of an area twice the size of Rhode Island have forced a different national reckoning? Would the pattern of regional drought, of slash-and-burn deforestation, of lumber industry practices that turned entire towns into kindling have been examined and corrected before the 1880 Michigan fires, the 1891 Wisconsin fires, the 1894 fires, the 1897 fires, all documented, all traceable to the same unaddressed conditions? Or was Chicago's fire not just the event that overshadowed Peshtigo, but the event that allowed the pattern to continue unchallenged for decades, while the dead in that Wisconsin cemetery remained nameless? I don't know the answer to that. What I know is this. On the night of October 8, 1871, Father Peter Pernin stood in a river for 5.5 hours with flames passing over his head, while the tabernacle of his church floated beside him in the current. He survived. He wrote it all down. He published it in 1874. For most of the following 150 years, almost no one read it. So here is what I want to leave you with, and I want your answer in the comments. If the press in 1871 had given the Peshtigo fire the same front page coverage as Chicago, same headlines, same national relief funds, same political pressure, do you think the lumber industry practices that caused it would have changed? Or would the economics have won regardless? Think about that, because the answer says something uncomfortable about how disasters get remembered and who gets to decide which ones matter.